Hello to all listeners and viewers around the world. I am Kadaria Ahmed.
And I'm Tomi Olugbemi.
Welcome to everyone watching and listening from across the globe. Welcome to Radio Now Specials, our series of conversations titled The Common Thread, where we want to look at the things that bind us as individuals, as nation states, and indeed as consequential citizens of the world. As we scramble to recover from a global pandemic, our fault lines are becoming stark. In Nigeria, we're facing multiple problems, each of which pose an existential threat. Real people are paying the ultimate price for our failures. Blood is flowing across the country, and we don't seem to have an answer. What do we do when our very existence is threatened? Where do we find the solutions?
Our keynote speaker today is one of those trying to help us find answers to this crisis. Dr. Bayo Akomolafe is a philosopher, psychologist, professor, and a poet. He is a teacher and a public intellectual renowned for his unconventional views on global crisis, activism, and social change. Dr. Bayo hopes to inspire what he calls a diffractic network of sharing and the politics of surprise that sees the crises of our times with a post-humanist lens. And he's joining us all the way from India. Dr. Bayo Akomolafe will be talking about nationalism, governance, and spirituality. Welcome to our common thread, Dr. Akomolafe. How are you?
I'm very good. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Doctor, for joining us. And just for the sake of those listening, the structure of this program is that Dr. Akomolafe will make his presentation. We'll go for a short break after that, and then when we come back, we'll begin our interactive session, and people will have an opportunity to engage, while Tommy and I will also engage with Dr. Akomolafe directly. Doctor, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm deeply humbled by the invitation and by the context, by your hospitality, and what we're trying to do here. Thank you for inviting me to have this talk. Let me start out by saying that I think it would be incredibly presumptuous of me to assume the role of an expert, a distanced expert who has all the answers. I think such a move would invisibilize the embodied intelligences of Nigerians in this time of crisis. So I'm not showing up as an expert who has all the answers. I'm here as a child with questions. And in fact, you might be wondering, why do we need to listen to this? Why do we need to listen to yet another talking head, yet another PhD, yet another professor-type person with no earthly relevance to our local, pressing, contextual issues? And I think you would be right to have those feelings and to have those sentiments. We've had the academic world in the country of Nigeria for a long time, and it might be said that the contributions to the everyday living of Nigerians, of Africans, hasn't stood up to the ideals that we look forward to. So I don't want to show up as an expert. I want to show up as like I said, someone with questions with a hint of emancipation, questions with that might break open new ways of thinking. And I also want to share that most of the conversations that usually revolve around the country at the moment are heavily dualistic and binary conversations. It's either you're for the government or you're against the government. Either you're pro-regime or against the regime, either you're pro-Buhari or anti-Buhari. I refuse to be contained by those binaries, and I'm looking, if we will, to find a third way between the binaries, a different paradigm of thinking about what is happening in the country, what is happening in Africa as a continent, and what is happening in the world at large. So let's go on with this fugitive exercise in extra paradigmatic thinking for a moment. What I come with is a strange suggestion that the way we think about the crisis that is, beleaguering us as a nation is part of the crisis. And that therefore, we need something much more than solutions. It is often the case that the rush to solutions repeats and reinscribes and reiterates the problems we're trying to leave behind. I can't remember the person who said it, but that problems are constraints, or solutions are problems with constraints, and problems are solutions with constraints. Sometimes our solutions mask problems as continuity. So I think we need more than solutions here. We need something radically different in order to witness the issues that confront us as a continent, as a nation, and I dare say as a species. Let me start by saying that over the course of a few years, those of us living in the African, Nigerian diasporic communities, we have witnessed a steady drip, drip, drip of, let me put it mildly, concerning news from home. It's the threat of secession and separation. It's the threat of disassembly, the haunting specter of a failed state. It's food insecurity, it's poverty. You know the drill. Casual violence, the breakdown of supportive infrastructure, the herder-farmer conflicts. And at this moment, I don't need to go through the long laundry list of things that beset us as a nation. I think the underlying question that we ask right now is why? Why is it that after 60 years of performative independence, of practiced independence, the dream of a Nigerian state is yet to take off for millions of its citizens? Why is it that the so-called giant of Africa, in spite of the burgeoning GDP indices, is facing the threat of closure? Well, those questions aren't new. I've been asking them along with my elders since I was a kid living in Nigeria. And the answers we've provided over time aren't new either. Let me remind you of some of them. You might know some of the ones that I propose. Why are we not there yet? Why haven't we arrived as a nation in spite of all the promise? One, it's corruption. You've heard that before. I've heard that before. We've heard it all together. It's corruption. If only we get rid of corruption, everything will be fine and dandy with us as a nation. Two, it's a leadership gap. It's a crisis of leadership and competence, or the lack of governance structures. If only we get the right team in Aso Rock, right? If only we elect the next good guy, our situation will be fine. And I've heard that over and over and over again. Let's look forward to the next elections. Let's get the right person in there. And if we do that, Nigeria has the promise to take off as the next superpower, the next African superpower. And then the ones we all recognize, and it's quite charged in the polity right now. It's the Muslims up north, or it's the infidels down south. It's the evil on the other side. It's always the story of those that don't get it, those that worship the right way, those that are backward, that are sorry excuses for humans. And this leads to the corollary. The consequence of such thinking is that if only we get people of our faith, if only we get people of our tribal affiliations, if only we get people of our ethnicity elected to positions of power, then we might see a brighter day. Let me mention a last one. It's the lack of education. It's illiteracy. So we need to educate more people, send more people to school. And with education and an educated populace, Nigeria would stand a chance of living out its dream of being the giant of Africa. However, I think these explanations are insufficient, stunningly insufficient. Let me start with corruption. We often think of corruption as the inadequacy of a system, the bad, viral, almost epidemiological gap in a system that leaves the system open to misadventures or demise or some kind of corruption. But I think bureaucratic corruption is also a form of colonial imposition. Let us not forget that the very existence of a nation state is a form of corruption itself. Let me break it down in this form. That children have the impulse to learn from each other. They learn and they look around, they imitate each other, they mimic each other. It is only within the context of factory-styled schooling that looking to the side becomes cheating. What if what we summarily call, and this is not to elide or dismiss the very pernicious and violent forms of corruption that one cannot excuse away. But what if, let's ask the question, what if what we call corruption is an imposition, is the resilience of indigenous ways of being that have been imposed upon by the nation state? What if the ways that we think about the world, are still incarcerated in particular forms of being that we now call the nation state assemblage? Let me move on. The second idea is leadership. And if only we get the right guy in there, if only we get the right lady in Aso Rock or on the throne, then everything will be fine. But that notion of leadership, that quest for the right team, it downplays the fact that humans are sponges of context, not independent agents acting upon the world. I remember in 2007 and 2008, jumping for joy when the United States elected President Obama, Barack Obama as president. And I loved his biography. I loved his background, a community organizer, a person for the people. And I expected that once this guy gets into the White House, I'm sure he would do stuff like progressive politics and all of that. What I didn't expect is that the White House was an actor, in itself, that Obama was, not the user as such, but also being acted upon by the resilience of the architecture of governance. In a way, we are not as coherent or as in charge as we think we are. The systems of governance are also actors. And so the idea that if only we get the right person with the right characteristics inside the White House, or inside Aso Rock, not the White House in this instance, inside Aso Rock, and then everything will be fine. It invisibilizes, it downplays the idea that Aso Rock is also an actor, that the nation state has its own imperatives, whether humans are present in it or not. But let's go ahead with these ideas. And then the other idea is that it's the other side, and those concepts and those ideas are quite charged right now in Nigeria. It's the ethnical, religious fault lines that it's dividing us, asunder, which recalls, brings to mind Chinua Achebe's "Things Fall Apart" and the center cannot hold. But it seems that the tragedy of the other, which is what I would call this reductionistic tale or story about the other side, the evil on the other side, the tragedy of the other is that we need the other to be fully ourselves. These reductionistic stories that we tell occlude and dismiss the complexities, the livelihoods of others that we have demonized as evil, as villains, or as wicked, right? And again, none of this is to really downplay the viciousness of the kidnappings, the horrible casual violence that now besets and beleaguers our streets in Lagos and other parts of the Federation. But it goes beyond the notion of blame, that in trying to find an answer, a convenient one at that, we tend to reduce the world into a unitary or atomic element, something that we can usually or pass around like a meme. And in doing so, we leave out the complexities of the situation. For instance, the idea that a certain faith tradition is evil, is wicked in itself, therefore the adherents are wicked, does not fully account for the fact that the text of a faith tradition of a religion isn't what determines the shape of that religion. A faith is an ecological, shifting, biological element or organisms, always in response to the environment around it. Let's not forget, for instance, that Christianity, globally touted as a religion of peace in the 11th to the 13th century, was responsible for the decimation of millions. I think the lowest estimates I've seen is about 1 million people. The highest is 3 million people. That between the 11th and the 13th century, the Knights Templar invading Jerusalem killed millions of people. And this is supposedly the religion of peace. Now, this is not, again, to downplay or demonize one faith or to elevate one above the other, just to say that the texts that we have, the sacred texts that speak about our faiths, are not the only things that shape our faiths. There are other things that are happening in response to a faith that makes that faith what it is. And we have to look at the global picture. We have to look at how adherents are responding to the world around them before we allocate blame in the simplistic ways we have done, which has led to only these weaponized binaries that we're used to. And then finally, this idea that illiteracy is the obstacle in our path. Well, I'm still of the opinion that grandmothers are custodians of wisdoms that are deeper than any PhD might have. Illiteracy is a colonial force. The idea that illiteracy, that we Africans or Nigerians had no way of understanding the world or measuring the world or navigating the complexities of the world prior to factory-style schooling education, is another invisibilization of the complexities that we have for ourselves. We built cities, we told stories. Illiteracy is not what's in the way. So I feel that education is not the linear bridge that we think of it as, that there is so much more when we consider what education could be in our times. But all of these explanations are insufficient. And the reason why they're insufficient is that we live in a more than human world. And you might have noticed that I'm getting there. The humans, what we call humans, are not the center of the planet. We're not the center of the universe. The things that beset us as a nation transcend human politics and human languages, but we tend to reduce it to our human concerns and human issues. So I want to bring to our consideration the idea of the Anthropocene. You might have heard of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is this time of rapid industrialization that has led to the terraforming of the planet in negative ways, that has led to the death of ecosystems. We're living now in a toxic soup of carbon. We're living now in the toxic soup of released chemicals into the environment. And these issues are not just environmental, because the environmental is already psychological. Now, for us to think about the Anthropocene, we have to recognize that the world is failing collectively. It's not just Nigeria. Across the world, nation states are failing. This is not just a Nigerian issue. Nigerian is the canary in the coal mine. I think that Africa is a prophetic, avant-garde system, that if you look at what's happening in Africa, you can tell what's going to happen in the future. It's no coincidence that Africa or Nigeria, which gave the so-called new industrialized world 11 million of its Black bodies, is now at another crisis moment where we're spilling out, and the prospects of failure have never been as poignant or as potent as they are right now. So collectively, nation states are failing. It's not just the escalation of migration. It's not just technological sophistication that distresses our notions of sovereignty It's the environmental crisis, the exclusivity of the nation state is falling apart. The reason why Africa, and specifically Nigeria, remains, I'll use an old term, underdeveloped, is because Africa has historically paid a price and subsidized the rapid industrialization of the world that is now troubling the planet. So I'm going to use a term that Michael and Matthew Omelski calls the African Anthropocene. What is the African Anthropocene? It's the drought in Sahel, the semi-arid region between the humid aspects of Africa and the Sahara Desert. It's the 7,000 oil spills in the Niger Delta. It's the conflict minerals that are built into our phones. It's the fact that the World Health Organization does not have indices to measure air quality in Africa, in Nigeria, in Lagos. It's the fact that we're constantly swimming in respiratory diseases, breathing in dust and toxic fumes of warfare emanating from the Niger Delta. These things are not just environmental, I want to state again. They are instigators of violence and behaviors that are leading to the demise we're witnessing in the world right now. The toxic soup that swirls around our chit-chat about the next great leader to come actually instigates the behaviors that we're trying to escape. So we're dealing with trauma. Trauma is not just experienced. Trauma does not need to be experienced to be traumatic. We're dealing with trauma at a fundamental molecular cellular level, at an ecological level. We're dealing with repetitive behavior, toxic cyclicity. In the ways we even dream about solutions, it's a trauma response, right? I could talk about two ways we think about responding to our problems. One is this dream of a superpower status. One day Nigeria will be a superpower. I think that's another traumatic response. It's another theology of mastery. Even if we could become a superpower, I don't think that it's desirable in these times of falling, of climatic changes. What the world is whispering to us is that our dreams of mastery, our dreams of progress, growth at any cost, needs to be revisited, that we cannot continue growing at all costs. The ideas of development that we're used to, colonial in their articulation, cannot continue unbothered. And that is what the world, I think, is whispering to us, even through a pandemic. And so, the other traumatic response is the idea of secession. If only we can remove ourselves from Nigeria, we can build ourselves another state, another nation state. That feels like, with due regard to everyone who is caught up in those secessionist, separationist agendas, that feels like a repetition of the same, that the way to respond to the oppression of a nation state is to build yet another nation state and hope that things are different. That is a traumatic response. It reinscribes the conditions of our incarceration. So we need, to wrap this up, we need a different aesthetic of responsivity. We need a different way of responding to crisis, one that does not depend on the state. What I'm calling for is a politics that is not the partisan, institutionalized politics we're used to. That what we need to do is to find a leadership of the gut, not the leadership of the brain, the leadership that is premised upon a supreme leader or a magical person or a competent person coming to fruition. But that is the leadership of the gut, of microbial assemblages, a coming together of bodies communally, that allows us to ask new questions, to conduct new inquiries into what we can do with one another. Because this Nigerian crisis is not just Nigerian alone. It is global and it is coming. And what we need to do as a people is to find our ways to each other. Until we do that, we will be caught up in dreams and fantasies of arrival, of mastery, and eventual supremacy that does not serve us and will not serve anyone in the long run. Let me stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bayo. That was a very, very powerful speech. And thinking about trauma as an ecological force. Never thought of that before. And how we humans tend to center ourselves as the, alpha organism in the universe. So thank you very much. It's now time for a short break. Kadaria and I will be back in 5 minutes and we'll engage with Dr. Bayo on the topic of the day.
Was saying is, um, based on your description of the nation state as something that's inherently corrupt because of the way it was set up anyway, there seems to be, you seem to be saying that there's an inevitability to the dysfunction we're seeing because of our current structures. Would that be correct? Is that what you are postulating?
Not that the nation state is inherently corrupt, but that the relationship between the nation state and what it seeks to colonize creates creates pathologies. It creates new realities, and that it makes invisible other realities. That's the focus, and that's the power or the potency of colonization. That every form of imposition is the negation or the pathologization of other kinds of realities. And I gave the example of children, that with schools, certain behaviors became pathological, even medicatable, right? That with the architecture of schooling, to look to the right and to the left in the classroom would be suspicious behavior. What would be outside of that architecture or that system, something quite natural. Here's what I'm pointing at, that it's not enough to just say corruption is a problem. What if the nation state itself is getting in the way of transformation and blossoming and abundant livelihoods? What if the kinds of self-hating remarks Nigerians make when we come back from abroad and we get into the airport and we see Murtala Mohammed Airport and the air conditioners are not working fine, and we hiss and we say, how come we're not doing it right? I'm just from Netherlands and it's fine, and it's good, it's functioning over there. What if all of this, what if the ways that we have been taught to think about how collectives and people should function, what if that's the problem in itself? And what is our incapacity to live up to the global nation state order, telling us about the resilience of other ways of being that we're trying to flatten out beneath the asphalt of modernity? What if, for instance, the ways that what the nation state calls bribery, right? Giving a police officer money, is the echoes of ways that we had gift cultures in the past. Gift cultures where you did not have to deserve, you did not have to fit neatly within a bureaucratic structure to deserve the blessings of a community. So I'm not for or pro those behaviors today. I'm raising conspiratorial questions about the ways that the assemblage of a nation state interacts with indigenous cultures, African cultures, Nigerian cultures, and what it makes possible and what it makes impossible.
But in many ways, the existence of nation states seems to suggest some sort of consensus. And even though, we kind of know how that consensus was arrived at, yes, through colonialism and other forms of oppression, but nonetheless some sort of consensus. In a world that is now so fractured, how do we find our way back to having a conversation that reaches to a consensus that enables us to question what is and try to dismantle it and maybe build something different?
I think it's possible, but I don't think it's plausible for us to have that kind of conversation at this moment. One, we think through categories. We're creatures of categories. We're creatures of habit. I don't know that we even know what it is to live outside nation states. We don't know how to think. We barely even know how to think of education outside of schooling, right? And here's the problem then, that what we need is something beyond our genius, something outside of human programs and projects and manifestos. We need a way of thinking about this that is about meeting the world at large, right? It's not about appealing to the nation state or the global nation state order. And I want to say as well that the nation state was not consensual. It still remains an imposition of a particular way of being in the world. It's a recent invention. It hasn't always existed, right? After kingdoms like Croatia and all of that, the global nation state order as exists today came on the heels of the First World War and the Second World War. So there's something militaristic and violent built into the current contraption of nation states. And this is how we live today. My thinking about this, and I'm not alone in thinking this way, is that it's not the existence of the nation state as a political unit is being tested by more than human elements in the world today. The pandemic has shown us that the nation state as a political unit is not as efficacious as we think it is. The fact that we have been flying ourselves to conferences across the world for 60, 70 years now to address climate change, and yet we still do not know how to get our act together, tells us that the idea of the nation state as the central acting force, the shelf life is dying. Okay. And so we need to find ways, post-nationalist cracks, ways of acting with each other that transcends those enacted boundaries, those linear boundaries. Yeah, I can speak more about that.
Okay, so Dr. Bayo, speaking about nation states, as you earlier mentioned, in Nigeria and many other countries actually, and there seems to be this otherness within the within, right? So there's a Christian, Muslim, illiterate, literate. How do we as a people navigate these differences while trying to function as a cohesive nation? Because we do exist as a nation state, right? And it's the reality, and I doubt if it's going to change anytime soon. So how do we navigate these differences and function as a as a good nation, for lack of a better term? Good, yeah, not good, but yeah.
Well, I don't know if we can function as a good nation, but I know we can function as good neighbors, okay. Right? I think that's the fugitive invitation right now, that we can function as good neighbors, we can function as brothers, we can function in ways that may not even have a language yet. And this happens every time, beneath the gaze of media, beneath the extrapolations of giant international institutions. We are connecting in ways that are not always noticeable. The idea is finding where we share common failures and common desires and common aspirations, and then connecting, building a politics around this. I might evoke the transatlantic communities, the African diasporic communities on the heels of slavery that emerged away from home. And how did they emerge? And how did they thrive under the boots of oppression? By finding ways to build home underneath the colonial master's gaze. They found ways to connect with each other. These are disparate African communities. They actually built new religions, Candomblé, Santeria, different ways of thinking about the world, different technologies. They built Gayap economical cultures. They built Rastafari. They built new musical genres. All of this was a way of connecting that did not depend on the nation state apparatus. But they found a way to connect with each other. And I feel that that's what we need to start doing today. If we find, or if we build a politics that is about being recognized by the nation state, that is about appealing to Aso Rock or appealing to City Hall, whatever City Hall means, wherever you are, then we will run the risk of repeating the trauma that we haven't yet addressed that keeps on haunting us as a nation. So yes, my brother, we are a nation state, and it might seem that we're going to be a nation state for a while longer. even though there's this prophecy that Nigeria has come to its near end. But I feel what we need to do right now might be the precursor for what the world is going to try to do in some years, perhaps in our lifetime. We need to find ways to connect with each other along the paths and algorithms of our failure, of our desires, of our wants, of our new questions in the face of large geological shifts and changes in the world.
When we sort of understand that at an intellectual level, but when you're dealing with a group of people for whom the casual violence that you referred to in your talk has become the norm,
right,
and life is brutish, and many are trying to eke out a living, it's often not that easy to talk to them about the othering and what it does. And so from a sort of practical point of view, if you were sort of looking to start these sort of conversations, is it at very basic communal level? I mean, what would be the advice of someone like you who runs a global community that grapples with these issues, but essentially tries to find the solutions at the most cellular, for lack of a better word, the cellular level, because you work in small communities in South America, in India, and sometimes partly in Africa. What are the sort of ways that communities should be looking to deal with these things?
Let me give an example that might have something to do with the pandemic and where I'm at now in India. That the pandemic made possible new questions that were not available prior to the pandemic. Questions like, wait, why are we sending our children to school? Why do we send our kids to school again? New questions and new ideas and concepts became available as a result of very dramatic shifts in the world, which we all witnessed and which we're still part of right now. The pandemic made possible new inquiries about the nature of work, the shape of the office space, the shape of urban spaces, the idea of education, even the very notion of the child. Things started to come up that were not present before. It's like we witnessed an insurgency of invisible things. And then we started to deal with that. And we're still in the research phase of that, still asking ourselves these questions. I feel, like you said, that it is not always going to be possible to get right down to the practice of building community. I feel that there will be times when a traumatic response to trauma seems like the only way that a response can go, right? In the heat of fire, in the heat of violence, it is very difficult not to otherize. It is very difficult not to paint the other side in a single picture, to use the phraseology of the term of Chimamanda Adichie. It's very easy not to reduce the other to a single story. But I feel that even then, there are breakages, there are rupturing moments, there are spaces that are available for us to meet with these questions. I feel that emancipation comes from inquiry, new kinds of inquiry that are made possible by larger shifts. Right now, Indian mothers, here in Chennai, are gathering, regardless of their religious or ethnic, affiliations, and are now gathering around the question of what do we do with our kids if now we're beginning to question the utility of the commute or sending them to school far away. What do we do with this moment? How do we meet the awkwardness of this moment? And I know that this isn't unique to India. It's across the world. These changes affected us in dramatic ways. And now we're asking questions. I think I ran into a feed where Nigerian mothers and fathers too are asking these questions about education. I feel these are the ways that we gather around, where differences become different, where we move away from the violent and weaponized edges that we're used to. Think about the ways we gather around football, right? The way football becomes an occasion for us to sing, and be motivated by a nationalistic sentiment. It's just that there are not, there aren't many occasions for that outside of soccer. Right? So the issue right now is how can a destructive moment like the pandemic, how can this huge cosmic event lead us to one another again? How can we gather around, possibly build a cartography, a map of new questions? And how can we invite people into the radical hospitality of that? I think it starts from asking those questions. It might start with you, Kadaria, opening up your home to a question and inviting people who are also distressed by that question to gather around for tea or eba or something. So the invitation is that there is an invitation at large in the world right now, and we need to take heed of that.
Now, Tommy wants to ask a question, but I want to just wrap up on this thing that we started
Right.
with. I know that you're not big on time as a concept. And when you talk to people now, they say to you, oh, things are very urgent. And what urgency does sometimes is to enable this trauma solutions that that you're talking about. So where you have a situation that people feel they're running out of time, you have a response to that the urgent times call for actually a slowing down. What do you mean by that?
Again, this is the unraveling, the apocalypse, and I think we're in an apocalyptic moment right now. The apocalypse literally means an unraveling, an unfurling, right? Not literally an end, a terminal end of things, but an unraveling of things that have been previously hidden. This isn't exactly news, but time as we conceive it is a Western invention. Time is not just natural there for everyone. It's not self-evident. The way we think about time as this linearity, this clockwork linearity, this idea that time proceeds from the past, enveloping the present and proceeding to the future, that is a colonial invention as well. There are other notions of temporality that have been existent for a long time. Africans have had notions of circular time or slushy time, the idea that the past is not quite done with, right? And the future is already inscribed in the past. And quantum physics, this is not a lecture about quantum physics, but quantum physics is dismantling this colonial notion of time as a foundational element of reality. It's inviting us to see that temporalities are multiple, diverse, and indeterminate. There isn't a single notion of time. So when I say the times are urgent, let us slow down, I'm inviting us to a different way of reacting or responding to a colonial assemblage that says the only way to solve our problems is to situate ourselves in this machine that continually produces the future by excavating Black bodies, by excavating the past, by displacing communities, by pathologizing anything that does not look like white modernity, right? So the invitation to slow down is not an invitation to do things slowly. It's an invitation to be aware, to broaden our awareness of what is happening in the world, what other things are inviting us to stay with them, whether shadows, whether ancestors, whether notions of the more than human. We're being invited to do something else, right? And you don't need to be a psychologist to know that it is often the case that a traumatic response deepens trauma and reinforces it and reinscribes it. I feel rushing to solutions, like I started out by saying in my presentation, rushing to solutions deepens our problems, because solutions are not what we need right now. We need new questions, new ways of thinking about ourselves.
A break. When we return, we'll have participation from our global and national audience. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our common thread. I am Tomi Olugbemi, and I'm here with my colleague Kadaria Ahmed, and we're still speaking with Dr. Bayo Akomolafe, who's a poet, philosopher, and a professor. And we've been talking about governance, nationalism, and spirituality. And now we have questions from our audience. The first question for Dr. Bayo is from Gacy Karuri Sabina, and it says, in the old Persian apodgm, I just butchered that word, one of the lines goes, he who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep, wake him up. Taken together, metaphorically, what do you think Nigerians may know and not know that it knows, perhaps in those margins that you speak of?
I heard someone put it differently, that you can't wake up a person who's pretending to be asleep, right? But the question is received well from my sister. What do Nigerians know and they don't know that they know? It's difficult to characterize these bodily, fleshly knowledges that escapes articulation. There is a sense in which we know that the world is alive, that things are not, that things transcend just the obvious, right? I grew up in a culture that speaks about aye, right? And a poor translation of aye is life. I think for my PhD, I studied aye, but aye is much more conspiratorial than just life. It's the idea that there are energies, that there are principalities and powers, you know, beyond just the statutory atomic ways we think about the world, that you could affect someone by saying something here, right? Even within the, you know, Christocentric Islamic religions, that idea carries into those their performances, that the world is much more entangled than we think it is. I think we know that at a level, in a way that education has not been able to stamp out. We understand respect and eldership and agency in ways that the schooling, nation-state apparatus has not been able to elide. Maybe those things might be useful now. I want to speak about, I want to say something about this that I often write about as the theology of the discarded, right? Right now, what we're performing when, for instance, the former president of the United States calls Nigeria and Haiti and other African nations shithole countries, what we're performing in our justified rage is the theology of mastery, right? How dare you call us that? We have roads, we have cars, we have spires, we have gleaming towers, we have GDP. How dare you belittle us that way? But I feel that in times of climate chaos, maybe we shouldn't be angling for a position at the top. It's just like rushing to the edge of the cliff and wanting to have a seat at the, you know, on the Titanic. Maybe we shouldn't be looking for a prominent position in a world that is dangerously designed not for the benefit of all of us, but just for the benefit of a few. I don't want to be adapted to a world that is sick, right? And in a sense, we understand some things that we're still learning and trying to articulate today. These things that I refer to as indigenous knowledges and wisdoms. We may not have written about them in books. We may not have PhDs around them, but we understand these things. And I think we need to revisit them. We need to revisit these grandmother wisdoms. Maybe what my friend here in India calls grandmother universities is what we need to reenact today. Listening to our elders and listening to our children in new enactments of emancipation.
Okay, so the next question is from Yegwa Upo, and he asks, I would like to know your opinion on this. If the ideas behind the way we currently think about society and organization that have been imposed on the world over the past few centuries are an emergent property of a desire to dominate and exploit the world.
Is there a question there? Could you continue?
So does this deny agency to the more than human order, or does it make it more manageable?
If I understand the question, I think what is invited there is a consideration of the ways we can congregate around a different notion of agency that isn't borrowed or dependent upon the nation state as we understand it today. And these are post-nationalist, post-humanist gestures. I think that new structures are possible, new worlds are possible, new rituals are possible, but we need to find ways of listening to them, new ways of congregating around these energies. And it's not going to be easy, right? But in a sense, it transcends considerations of whether it's difficult or easy. It's just something we have to do right now because we have no other way to go.
In your initial speech, you talked about how the world seems to be suffering from an ecological trauma, right? And how humans tend to center ourselves in the universe. So I want you to just expand on that. What did you mean exactly?
Psychologists, biologists, political scientists are now coming to terms with the possibly shocking idea that the mind isn't contained within the human. That, and concepts of the external mind or external cognition are now rife, in literature. We think about the extended mind, that is, we think with the world and the world thinks with us. And then there are also fascinating explorations of how emotions are transmitted, right? Again, the liberal humanist idea that emotions are contained within our bodies is being upended by, I would call it, new revelations, the news, that that emotions are not actually human phenomena, that there is a sense in which land can feel. There is a sense in which a place has a feeling. You might even understand that colloquially by, how we can enter into a room and you just get a sense of what's happening in the room, even without interacting with anyone in the room. It's like the air is stiff in the room. And so these are edgy conversations about the post-human, about how the things that we often allocate to ourselves, agency, emotion, intellect, cognition, conation, are not ours to begin with. They're environmental, they're ecological, hence a field like eco-psychology. Now, what I mean then is that trauma is not human. Trauma, a place can be traumatized, a temporality can be traumatized. We can quickly get into traumatized ways of repeating and repeating and repeating ourselves, a toxic cyclicity, if you will. And so that means, that suggests to me that even the way we respond to these crisis events in Nigeria, for instance, to be specific, how we respond to the herder farmer conflicts, how we respond to ethnic violence, how we respond to religious conflicts, by trying to stamp down the conflict or trying to divide even further. That is a traumatic response. And how is it a traumatic response? It's a traumatic response in that it uses the resources of that epistemology. It uses the resources of that arrangement to try to understand and address that arrangement. And that is what keeps us in our situation. That is what keeps us in our troubles. And so we need a break. Trauma needs a break to be released elsewhere. Trauma is not the bad thing that we often make it out to be. But if it gets still, just like stiff air in a room that has no windows, then we get stuck. And so what we're looking for is an unstuckness. What we're looking for is air to breathe, something that releases us from this repeatability, this desire that says the only way to think about emancipation is if we get a new leader, if we get a new political party, or if we build a new state from scratch. That is just toxicity repeating itself.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bayo, for that. There's a comment and a question from Mr. J. Naidu. He said, a beautiful rendition of the state of the world, Brother Bayo. The one thing I have realized is that changing systems is not rocket science. Our biggest challenge is challenging the human being. So does oh God, what does it, so some of the biggest questions that we need to be able to answer, he said something like that, is what does it mean to be African? What does it mean to be human? Because all of our differences are man-made.
I thank my brother Jay Naidu for the question about what it means to be African. I think that there are like a rhizome, like a map, there are different entry points into the conversation about identity. We can start from historical circumstances. We can start from shared visions of the future. We can start from the more biological and the more material and say that I'm connected to this land and to this continent in a way that gives me the permission to lay claim to an African identity. We can speak about geographical conveniences that allows us to say, I was born here or my people come from here, and this is what it means to be African. But there is a sense in which that what it means to be African is also nomadic, also changing over time. Recently, I came to some news that they found, well, not all lost continents are real. Some of them are mythical, but some scientists have discovered that some continents that were supposedly mythical actually existed, and it changes the shape of what Africa looks like then, because this continent that's supposedly missing was part of the African continent. I wonder then that beyond geographical conveniences, beyond the biological, beyond the material, are there other ways in which what it means to be African is changing, is shifting, especially in pandemic times when things are not as clear, or Anthropocenic times where things are not as clear as they once used to be? It's the same question we might ask about what it means to be human. That's a dangerously fascinating question, because I don't know what it means to be human these days when we're becoming cyborgian, when we are almost materially connected with our devices. When the first cyborg human being, I think from Europe, has now gained citizenship. He has a light bulb connected to his head, and he's the first approved cyborgian citizen of planet Earth. I don't know what it means to be human in a time when biologists are telling us that we do not think as much as we do from our brains, as much as we do, from our guts, that our guts lay equal claims to being human as much as we do. And if our guts, populated by microbes and viruses and bacteria, are already environmental, then what does it mean to be human then? So maybe I'm not trying to find a new definition. Maybe the question then is, how do we draw new lines in the sand? And what risks are we taking when we draw the line here and say, this is what it means to be African, as opposed to being non-African? And this is what it means to be human, as opposed to being non-human. Over time, white male bodies have become the ideal of the human, and Black bodies have been relegated to the end of the spectrum, right? We're closer to the animal. We're not as human as the humans, like Animal Farm. We're not as close to the precipice or to the top of a pyramid scheme, if you will. And I wonder if I want to stay within this spectrum of being human. Maybe we should abandon the continent of being human and perform new ways of being in the world. That does not allocate or tether us to the incarceration of being human. If being human is responsible for the Anthropocene, then maybe we should start trying to be something else.
So, and the next question is from Bolaji Ahmed.
Okay.
And he or she asks, I believe strongly that Africans, leaders and citizens, do not think like freedmen, but as free men. I could say probably this is how the West wants us to think. I would like to ask, how do we change this narrative And how do we help our coming generation and the present generation, if possible, to think as free people and not as a freed generation?
Interesting device there, freed but not free. Independent but still dependent, right? Given sovereignty but still attached to colonial systems of capture. And it's my worry as well that we are still, an elder mentor of mine who's late right now used to tell me that Africans, if you're speaking about Nigerians to be specific, that Nigerians are used to Panadol, but we don't like paracetamol. And I think what he was trying to say was that we are addicted to endpoints and solutions, and we don't have a lot of patience with process. We don't have a lot of patience for the middle, what gets us there. And maybe that speaks to our roles as eternal recipients of Western benevolence. We're constantly, when is the next expert coming? When is the IMF going to save us? Or we're so powerless that we need United Nations or UNESCO to come in. And only then are we finally validated, when we are seen by these massive international or international superstructures. I feel that maybe changes start to happen when we recognize that those systems are failing themselves. Right? The honest thing to say, I think someone coming from the West would be radically honest to say, we also have lost our way. We have no clue what we're doing. We have no idea what we're doing. In fact, we thought we knew what we're doing when we created this capitalist, late stage capitalist, hyper-consumerist system. We thought we knew where we were going when we built a future premised on eternal growth. But right now we're in a lot of trouble. Like, this is the radical, honest truth. We're in a lot of trouble and we don't know where to go. We don't know how to respond to the pandemic. Vaccines can only take us so far. But the conditions of possibility that will give birth to later pandemics are still quite present with us. And that's the Anthropocene. That is ongoing encroachment of ecologies and ecosystems. We don't know how to respond to the escalating temperatures or ocean acidification or the loss of biodiversity. We don't know how to do this. We're beaten around the bush as well. So when we start to learn more about the failures of these systems that we're addicted to and fixated upon, then I think it might liberate us to try to find and create new knowledges, new fugitive, and I keep on saying the word fugitive, because the fugitive is the refusal of the plantation, of the slave cotton plantation, and the plantation that reproduces the same over and over again. We will find our way when we lose our way, when we untether ourselves from these systems that proliferate the same realities that we're trying to escape. But we have to learn more about these failures. And we have to be open to the fact that it is left to us, not to a visitor, not to a PhD coming from abroad, not to a new manifesto, or not to a new political party. It is left to us. It might actually be left to us, our children, our neighbors. We have to learn anew and unlearn. This is the time of unlearning our mastery, unlearning our servitude to giant systems. And only then, in these soft political moments that are not tethered to institutional partisan politics, only then would we be able to catch a glimpse of an otherwise, of a different kind of future, but probably not available for us right now.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me, Dr. Bayo. I don't know if they've corrected my audio. Are you able to hear me at all or not?
Can you hear me, Dr. Bayo?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you, Tomi.
Okay, so there's a question from Amina, and she says, regarding Nigeria, you mentioned we need a break from the trauma. Can you give an insight into this, and how do we take a break and break off the cycle of toxicity?
Oh, yes. That is the question, the million naira question. No, not a million naira, maybe the 10 million naira or 100 million naira question. How do we break away from this toxic cycle, this dreaming that leaves us wanting, this, oh, it's going to be the next regime that will save us. And then we vote. And then it's disappointing. And then we say, probably the next voting cycle will deliver us our salvation. All we need to do is pray harder, or vote harder, or work harder. And then we're left in the same place. How do we break away from this toxic cyclicity? I feel that breakages are not human things to do. That might come as a surprise because we're used to thinking that emancipation is left to us, as humans, it's left to our ingenuity, it's left to our education, it's left to our competence. I do not think that is the case. I think transformation is a shared alliance and partnership between humans and their more than human worlds, right? Just like I said earlier on, that the pandemic afforded us a new way to glimpse education. In the same way, breakages come when we are able to, when things that are larger than us allow us to be freed from certain ways of viewing the world. So the question is not how do we break? I would reframe the question. The question then is, where are the breakages already? Where are the ruptures? And how do we sit with those ruptures? How do we sit with those places that are already opening up with new agency, with new, sometimes conspiratorial and controversial questions? How do we sit with them, right? It's not for us to break the world into two and find our way out of it. That would reinstate the concept or the idea that we are in charge of our own salvation. We are in charge of things, which is the trouble with the Anthropocene, right? Those kinds of thinking have brought us here. And we don't want to repeat that, you see. So the issue then is not how do we break, is how do we stay with the breakages that are already present.
Dr. Bayo, thank you so much for that. If I could ask you to go a little bit deeper into that, you are not suggesting a certain docility in that people fold their arms and do nothing.
No.
So, because it's just important to sort of get into that, because some of these concepts are quite new to people like me. So
yes,
sort of
I understand.
To wrap our hands around sitting with something, but in a way that is active and does not, mean folding your arms and letting sort of bad things happen to you.
Right. We will behave like our context, right? If my daughter were to fall into that storied zoo was it in Ohio, where a silverback gorilla dragged a child into its den, I don't think I'll hold up my phone and say the times are urgent, let us slow down. I would rush right into that den and try to redeem my child, right? So people behave like their contexts, like their situations. And so this is not a universal or universalizing or totalizing prescription for how to behave in every circumstance. It is a soft gestured invitation to treat transformation in humble and modest ways. But to your thinking, my sister, the idea that this is quite rampant, that it's either we're doing something or we are not doing anything, right? It's there are worlds in between that duality, right? I think most of the problems we're facing today is because we're doing and doing and doing, and we do not recognize that we're creatures of larger doings than the ones that we're exhibiting, that we are part of larger fields of doing, and we do not know how to even language those doings, right? And so it's upon us to articulate transformation and emancipation, not in ways that are binary, it's either you're doing or not doing, but in ways that open up new spaces of power, Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that in soft and modest ways of connecting with others, of holding space for a question, or inviting sanctuary, what I often name as sanctuary or making sanctuary, or building ritual, creating art, and inviting movement around a certain conception of the universe that might be diametrically opposed to the ways that we have been taught to think about the way the world works. That in doing such things, it might seem small, it might seem, not scaled up, it might seem insignificant. But I think those are the places where we need to occupy that might lead to new transformative moments. I'm speaking about what the Palestinians call mujawara. Mujawara is a technology of neighboring. Now, Palestinians, as we all know, are under the boots of Israeli oppression, right? They have been suffering under this imposed nation state. What do they do under those circumstances? They, I don't want to say invented, that seems too mechanical, but for the lack of a better word, they invited or invented a way of meeting each other that they called mujawara. And mujawara means neighboring, right? It's a way of sharing meal, but it's also a way of thinking about the future, thinking about neighbors and their needs in that moment, thinking about how we transcend the other and otherizing practices. And it's how we care for each other in deep ways that are not available. It's how Taksim, the protesters in Istanbul in 2013 and 2014, the Taksim Gezi Park protesters, how they cared for each other in the face of oppression. It's how the Cairo protests happened. It's how the slaves in the New World cared for each other. These things may seem small and insignificant, but in a world where a tiny, almost infinitesimal object, such as the virus, the coronavirus, can upend entire economies, I don't know that we can hold space for smallness anymore. So this is about doing that does not lend itself to the repeatability of the master. This is about noticing that sometimes in our vigorous, righteous, justified response to crisis, we repeat the crisis. That sometimes the nation state actually is enriched by our protest, right? Ironically, that sometimes, in fact, the nation state allocates a space in its algorithms for protest to happen. And then when it happens, we leave our marches, with the sense of, I did something today. And maybe I have changed the system just by, protesting the system. But the system has become resilient. Protest is now by the way. It has ways of enveloping and appropriating our fury and our rage. So we need something else. You see, we need something else that does not play into the game. Or like my brother here in India would say, if we beat them at their own game, we've lost, right? So we need something other than the game that we keep on playing, right? And this is not a dismissal of protest. This is not a dismissal of our many activisms. It's just a call to notice that we are caught up and roped in more things than we care to notice, or more things than we care to language. And we need other forms of power. And it's no one's place to prescribe what this power looks like. It comes in experimentation. It comes in unlearning. It comes in asking questions and in creative explorations of what this might look like politically and locally.
We are fast running out of time, but there are a few people who still want to ask a few questions. So I'm going to get a few in before coming back to you for the answers to those questions and then for you to wrap up. The first question is going to come from Yegwa, and he wants to ask it directly. Yegwa?
Yes.
Okay, hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, brother.
Okay, thank you so much for
you.
this. Let me see if I can make it quickly. So basically, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about sounds like really becoming a practitioner of sorts. You need to, like it's a call for us to be able to engage with the world differently. But I
Yeah.
find that in my own life, in my own practice, there seems to be a conflict between this new perspective, this new way of being, and the way the world is, what the
Uh-huh.
world considers valuable, and how we're supposed to behave. So in your own practice, I mean, like in a place like Nigeria, if one was to sort of talk like this or act like this, there's going to be friction. People will think, oh, you're
Yeah.
not acting properly, or exactly. So, how do you balance that? I guess is the question I'm asking. How do you remain relevant and be able to attend to your own responsibilities? For example, even if it's just for something as basic as being able to eat, do you think one needs to detach from society completely? Or is this the kind of thing that you can still do within society? So that's my question. Thank you.
Well, coming from someone who detached from society, no, I don't think it's possible to detach from society completely. But I will say that I was, why this is very significant for me personally is because as a lecturer in Nigeria, I said these things. It kind of rendered me a maverick, and and I was not really listened to. Like, shut up, this is not what we should be talking about right now. So it was it led me to seek other ways of thinking and other communities that might be willing to hear. Not that I have some messianic strand here, but other people that are willing to share these ideas and these concepts with, and who might also nourish the ways that I feel led to think about the world today. So, my brother, I don't think it's going to be always available. I don't think the environment is going to be always nurturing for us to think in these ways. That's the bad news. The good news is that I think it's increasingly possible to think in these um, alternative ways, right? To approach these things from new and fresh perspectives. I think the fabric of the polity, especially in Nigeria, we're speaking about Nigeria today, I think it's stretching a bit. I remember traveling once many years ago and having a conversation with a gentleman on a plane and telling him that we are unschooling our kids, right? That our kids do not go to school. And he was shocked that how dare you? This is poisonous. This is terrible. Why would you not send your child to school and stuff like that? Why would you deny them the choice of being educated? Of course, it escaped him that in sending them to school, I'm also denying them the choice of not being educated, right, within the school. But recently, I think my most recent trip, pre-pandemic trip to Nigeria, I came across a couple who were fascinated, and they were actually open, and they said, we've been trying to share these ideas. We've been trying to ask these questions for some time, but we've never found anyone that is open to this. So I think we're in such interesting times that the fabric of possibility is opening up, and you might find people be beneath the guise or beneath the guise of business as usual, are quite open to exploring these ideas, exploring these concepts, exploring these questions. So hang in there, hang in there. The space is opening up for new conversations, and maybe that's where we should focus on today.
Okay, and one final question, Dr. Akomolafe, and this is from Mustafa Sahid. He says, I believe that there are many things that are wrong about the way we behave and think as citizens. However, humans are imperfect. Still, it is in spite of those imperfections that we have come up with a justice system, democracy, accountability, healthcare, and even the media. While we point to these structural imbalances, we must have practical responses to our issues in a way that salvages ourselves. Can we take our conversation to the human attempt with special reference to Nigeria? What needs to be done?
I guess what
Um,
I hear, Dr. Komolafe, is people are still grappling with the practicalities of
yes,
embedding some of these ideas.
it takes some sitting with. It again, I resist, as I started out saying, I resist the easy prescriptive solutionisms that we're used to, like do this and do this, and then things will be fine. I would invite people to struggle with this. And I trust in the intelligences, not just of people listening and people that will listen, secondarily, people that will come in touch with these ideas, which are not from me, but they're ideas that are available in the world at large, that are inviting us to do something differently. It takes some struggling. Paradigmatic shifts are difficult to navigate, but there's something here. If we just stay with it a little while, like Jacob, in the Bible, whose thigh was undone by the blow of the angel, by God himself wrestling with him. We need to be broken in some ways. We need our thighs to come undone. And only then might we slow down and learn new ways of being in the world. So, but let me stay with this question for a while by my brother Mustafa. That's a mighty spiel there. I'm just going to take one strand of it and respond to it by saying that, yes, humans are imperfect. Thank goodness for that. I cannot tolerate the idea that we are, or we would be perfect. My systems of thinking do not allow for completion. And I think the creativity of the world is that it's ongoing. It resists totality. It resists finality and arrival, or perfection. But I want to say something about justice. That recently Germany paid an African nation 1.1 billion euros as a justice payment for the 1904 to 1907 decimation of people in that particular country. And I also want to bring in George Floyd, right? And payments to African Americans to make up for the killing of Black bodies on the streets. I don't know if I'm the only one, I'm sure I'm not the only one, in wondering that, is that enough? Wait, what would enough look like? What would justice look like if we were to really take seriously these ideas? Is $1 billion enough to pay for 11 million bodies transported across the Atlantic? How much is enough? Or should we leave that algorithm behind and think and maybe come across the controversial idea that it might just be the case that justice often gets in the way of transformation, that justice is the way the state pays us to let go of desires that might be fugitive.
And
right?
Finally, I know we said finally before, but one final. Dr. Amina Waziri Ibrahim wants to ask a question in person.
Okay, I actually asked the question earlier. I'm the one that asked, how do we take a break from the trauma?
Right.
But yes, but I already asked that question, but you've just said so many fascinating things, and it's really got me thinking. I would have asked so many questions, but I thought maybe asking more than one question would be too much.
No, it's not.
But
I don't think so.
So I'm required to, because I didn't actually make a request for a second question. I didn't know I was supposed to. I would have lined up maybe 10, 15 questions to ask. What you said earlier, I joined a bit late actually because I didn't get the Zoom ID early. But when I came on, I remember you were talking about feelings, about places having emotions. That it's not just human beings that have emotions. Feelings also have emotions. So is that sort of like telepathy? Something like that?
Right. My next book is about slave telepathy. But yes, what I'm trying to say here is refer to in the literature as, especially if you dive into eco-psychology, there is something dramatic. And of course, it should be dramatic to people who are new to these conversations. I mean, could you mute your mic just so that I can respond?
Okay, I'm just leaving the place
Yeah.
now.
Okay, thank you. And so what I want to signal is the idea that humans are participating within fields of emotionality, right? It's like a flip on its head. It's not that we feel, it's that emotions are territorial and they enlist us, right? There is a sense in which depression travels in the air that might not need to invoke ghosts, right? And I could speak to you, I'd share with you maybe in a different context, some research, that shows that emotions might be volatile and populating the air, right? So that we're not only in a global warming, period of carbon involved with carbon and greenhouse gases. We might also be in a global warming situation that involves certain emotions. Maybe the fact that today feels pressing, that most of us feel depressed and we don't know why, right? That there's something about these times that that might help us understand that a certain emotion has gained territoriality. So these ideas are not exactly new, and I didn't invent them, but they're invitations to treat trauma as land-based as well, right? For instance, in the United States, there's a huge conversation about racism, right? And most white commentators would say, oh, get rid of it. It's done. It's past. Stop speaking about the past. But that denies the idea that trauma is resilient. Trauma is intergenerational. It doesn't have to be felt to be active and to materialize in our bodies.
Okay, yeah,
Right?
thank you,
So
Dr. Bayo.
in the same way, can I just end that point?
Yes,
That in the
yes, you
same
may.
way,
Yes, you may.
in the same way, emotions are territorial. And what we're being invited to do now is to go beyond treating ourselves as singular agents of feeling and to treat trauma as, larger than we have been taught to think it is.
Thank you, Dr. Akomolafe. Could we have your final thoughts before we wrap up?
Final thoughts. Well, this is something I'm used to saying, and I'll end by saying that. But let me say that the ideas here are not, I claim no authorial, I'm not the author of these ideas. I'm navigating these complexities as well. And though times are shifting and allowing us to think in these ways, these seditious ways, that might not lend itself very quickly to a new tool or a new app or a new technology, which is the way we like to think. Like, let's create a new app from this, and then we can solve all our problems. But I think that this is the time to really slow down and to struggle. And only then, only with struggling with these issues, contending with these forces and ideas, might a new sprout of emancipation, a new shoot of emancipation sprout from the ground and allow us to meet each other in new ways. Nigeria remains my home, my dearly beloved country, and the crises that beleaguer the country at this moment are not beyond us. But in order for us to meet it in new ways, we need to think differently. We need to think beyond the paradigms we're used to. So the times are urgent. Let us slow down. Those are my final thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akomolafe, for a very enlightening conversation. It was our absolute pleasure. Thank you. And that's it for the show today. Many thanks to Dr. Bayo Akomolafe and to you, our lovely listeners. Yes, hoping a spark has been lit and you are able to carry this conversation into your individual spaces. Yes, these are troubling times for our nation, and while talking will never be enough, conversations are always a good place to start. Thanks again. I am Tomi Olugbemi.
And I'm Kadaria Ahmed. And our common thread, the second edition of our common thread, is coming up in September, where we hope to bring you another global thinker. Thank you again, Dr. Akomolafe. This has been very interesting and very educative. We hope that you will not be a stranger to Radio Now, and at some point in the future you will come back and engage again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.